everybody. Welcome to the Big Igloo Podcast. Shalom. We're back again. Smart Theology,
yes, sir.
Dumb dad jokes. And I'm coming up empty on the dad jokes, sorry.
Again, it's about a 50-50 if you get a dumb dad joke at the beginning.
Right.
But you'll sprinkle them in. It just
I
flows out
know.
of you.
It does flow out of me. Like Travis said, I think of an episode or two ago, au naturel. So we don't need to encourage it. But here's what we're going to do, gentlemen. We are starting into a new series. Hey, thanks for tuning in. And I hope you enjoy this. This is going to be based on Frank and Zach Turek. Frank Turek wrote the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. He's a Christian apologist. Actually been out here to Kearney a couple years ago. One of my favorite Christian apologists. Really cross-examined ministry. So if you want to check them out, go ahead. But he and his son they co-wrote a book called Hollywood Heroes. And if you're watching us live, Travis and John each have a copy. I've got the audio version I've been listening to when I go to the gym. And I really, really, really love something that Frank has done that I think even just for myself as a pastor, one who like preaches messages, tapping into these ideas of narrative and showing, parallels between our faith and what things that we can redeem out of these stories and stuff. And so, listen, even if you're not, let's just say, even if you're not a superhero follower person, I still think there's some stuff that you can get out of this.
Absolutely.
And as we go through this series, I want you to be thinking about just even maybe conversations that you can have. Because this book, I tell you what, if you got someone who's really into the Marvel comics or someone who's really into Star Wars or someone who's in, and maybe even say like Harry Potter. Ooh, we're going to get to that in a few weeks. All right. So stay tuned for that.
Sorry, mom and dad.
But here's the thing is there a way that we can, engage people, even if you've never seen these movies?
Right. Yeah.
I think that, and by the way, just a huge disclaimer here. This is not some form of like endorsement of these movies.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Or all things in the movies.
Right.
Instead, here's what I want to propose. All right, gentlemen.
Right.
I came across this. This is not original to me, but I came across this idea that I have found very helpful as a pastor. It's something that even when I was in youth ministry, I was trying to instruct youth to think along these lines. And it's these 3 R's. That as we engage with societies, we engage with culture, and I think Frank does a good job of really doing this in the book. And by the way, each chapter of the book, we're gonna skim parts of it, but we're not gonna be able to handle everything that he handles. So if you like what we're saying, I highly recommend this book, Hollywood Heroes by Frank and Zach Turek. But here's a great tool that I think, as a pastor, equipping people to think along these lines of receive, reject, redeem.
Nice.
That when it comes to the culture at large, what can I, and this can apply to so many things.
Yeah.
This is not just entertainment, but specifically with entertainment, when I'm watching a movie, to think to myself, what can I receive from this? Right. What in this story lines up with biblical values? Maybe you're watching a romantic comedy and you see sacrificial love. Well, you can receive a message like that. That's a good thing, right? Yeah. But what things do I have to reject? I'm going to push it, Travis, here. It just came natural. What things can I reject? Because I can't accept everything. I can't accept maybe certain sexual situations. I can't accept maybe certain messages, or maybe a win at all cost Machiavelli type. That's not the way of Christ. Ends justify the means. Well, I don't think so. Right. So even that, I can see themes like that play out. I may be able to receive some things, but I might have to reject other things.
Yeah.
Okay. What can I redeem? What can I redeem? And so when I look at something, and, we'll probably get to this, even with Star Wars, I'm a big Star Wars fan.
Oh, yeah.
But there's some things where like for example, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, I'm sure. But like George Lucas talks about the Force, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of that coincides with Eastern religion, right?
Right.
It's pantheism, that God is in all things, right? And we, as Christians, we have to reject that. But can I redeem this idea that Christ does sustain everything by the word of his power, right? That in sense, in him all things hold together.
Sure.
So there's a message that can be somewhat redeemed there, but I got to be conscious and aware. So I just want to throw that out there, this idea of receive, reject, redeem.
Right. Cool.
When I'm sitting in, and this can apply to music, this can apply to things in my daily life, that what can I receive? What do I have to reject according to the Bible?
Right.
Yeah.
And what things can be redeemed? I don't know. So I throw that out there, gentlemen. How does that strike you or hit you? Or
Yeah. Well, I remember you preaching a message in youth group, and you played a bunch of clips for just kind of pop culture shows, things like that. And it's caused me. I still every once in a while in like theaters, like I'll be watching something like I've got this like line of like, oh nope, no, yeah, that's not the gospel right there.
Yeah.
Or like, oh man, like I can't wait for the Batman because I've always said that the Dark Knight. Man, there's some serious like just gospel message in that, the evil of the Joker, kind of depravity of man, and all that stuff. It's it's great. It's a good way of just engaging with the culture and again protecting yourself.
That's right.
From compromise.
Yeah.
But at the same time too, receiving those powerful messages.
I've always heard. I've never heard it per se the 3 R's.
Yeah.
But I've always heard it: chew the meat, spit out the bones.
Yeah.
And I do a mentorship with a couple of young guys, and I challenged them. I said, stop listening to charismatic preachers. I was like, for half a year, don't listen to charismatic preachers. Expand your library and learn how to chew the meat, spit out the bones. Because it's a huge thing as Christians for us to be able to, because we're Grace Fellowship, non-denominational, aren't the only ones who get revelation.
Right.
And so that idea that you can go to somebody else and still get revelation, and there might be some things you disagree on, that's okay. Spit out the bones.
Yeah.
And so that's an idea that I've heard before, but I've never heard that. I like the 3 R's probably better because it gives you a guideline, but yeah.
Well, and I even think about like what you're saying there, John, because there's this level of maturity, right? And I think for our listeners, viewers, like you've got to be kind of where you're at in your journey of faith, because you might not know what things you can receive or what things you can redeem. So you do have to be kind of grounded and make sure you're putting yourself in a place where you're growing and you're learning, you're studying to show yourself approved, a workman that needs not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Yeah. Like that's the goal for all of us as Christians. But if you're new in this journey, well, it's okay. Yeah. But you need to surround yourself and get into places where, you're not in some sort of echo chamber, right? Where you're just kind of hearing, one side. But it can be confusing while you're out there. And so that's why I don't want to take anything that we say as like an endorsement of any of these movies. Again, you have to follow your own conscience on this. Just because we're talking about Captain America doesn't mean you have to go out and watch the movie or Iron Man or whatever. But we do want to. I do think there's going to be some value in just hearing these stories and seeing that there is some truth in the myth.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I was going to say too, like, and Frank does a good job pointing this out in the introduction. He talks a lot about how fiction kind of presents us with some scenarios that we wouldn't normally be in.
Yeah,
and so kind of like it starts to make us think a little bit about, well, how would I react in that situation? And the power of kind of fiction blew my mind. He talked about the Navy SEALs.
That they read fiction for that purpose, right?
Yeah.
To expand like their imagination.
Huh. So, the commander of like the Navy, like, is putting out these like, it's crazy.
Well, and we'll probably maybe get to this, with like J.R. Tolkien with like the Lord of the Rings. I know we're going to get to Captain America here in a second, but one of the things that was really interesting about C.S. Lewis and his journey to faith is that C.S. Lewis, who was invited by J.R. Tolkien, the guy who wrote Lord of the Rings, Tolkien probably had a huge influence on C.S. Lewis. And I mean, here's C.S. Lewis, probably one of the greatest thinkers in the last several hundred years, who becomes an apologist for Christianity. And he was an atheist, but then comes to faith. And one of the things that C.S. Lewis noticed, and he was a master. I just went through his book, Until We Have Faces, which was based on an old Greek, story, whatever. And so he kind of revised it or whatnot. But C.S. Lewis, he was a literary genius, and he was aware of all of these other stories. But he started picking up on this idea that Frank kind of taps into here, that it's like there is some of these commonalities between all of these stories, even stories we're telling today, even stories that are like old literary classics, like it's like good prevails over evil, and there's self-sacrificial love, and there's all of this stuff that C.S. Lewis, it's like he looked at our world and said, is God trying to communicate to us through these myths because there's a true myth?
Yeah.
He believed Christianity was the true myth, like it's the story. And when we say myth, we're talking really just myth in this broad sense of story. That the story of Jesus is the true myth, is what is kind of how I'm paraphrasing here, but how he understood that. And so that's where we're going with this series. So let's jump in. Let's talk about the Cap.
Yeah.
Mr. Steve.
So
Steve Rogers.
Yeah.
Should I tell my Steve Rogers story?
Yeah, let's do it.
So I'm just gonna full disclosure here. These guys are probably gonna drive this more than me because I've seen the movies like once, and so anyway, we were at a youth pastors. It was actually a prayer summit out in Colorado Springs, and Jarman and Travis went with me, and they paid for us to go see. Was it Winter Soldier?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it was Winter Soldier.
Was I there?
I'm not sure.
where-
I think it was before your time. I think.
Oh, I remember I was going to a movie. That's all I remember.
Okay.
I slept through the whole thing though.
Well, okay, so this is the deal, so we go through these days, these seminars and workshops and whatever, and so it's like, I don't know, like 10 o'clock at night, and plus it's an hour behind out there, and they had the reclining chairs, and so I was a little too comfortable, and I mean, we're like, I don't know, 45 minutes into the movie, and I'm out, right? And I seriously, I enjoy watching movies, but
Right.
I'll just be honest with some of the action movies. It's like you blow up 3 or 4 buildings and I'm just out. I'm just like, whatever. Oh, another building went up in flames. Big deal. Not that I need story. I need plot.
Sure.
You blow up a building. Okay, that's cool, but let's move on. Right. And so some of those scenes, like they just don't, they don't do anything for me.
Tell us how you really feel, Kris.
I know. Yeah. So this movie is 4 Rotten Tomatoes. No. But anyway, so I fall asleep. Now the next day, here's the thing. I know so little about Captain America. I just know Captain America. That's all I know. And we're in the car driving home the next day, and Jarman and Travis are just having this conversation back and forth. And I hear like Travis being like, "Well, Steve Rogers and blah blah blah," and then he's like, "Well, yeah, but Steve Rogers also," and I'm just hearing these guys talk back and forth. I turn to Travis and Jarman and I go, "Who's Steve Rogers?"
Wow, that's so bad.
That is Captain America. That's his name. I had watched at least 2 Captain Americas. I'd completely forgotten he was Steve Rogers. That's Captain America. That's all I know. Anyway, so yeah, it's
good.
So go ahead, take it away.
All right. Well, I mean, Captain America, like the first Avenger.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what he's referred to. And so yeah, like back in the 40s. Obviously World War II is like kind of, it's going on,
right?
Everyone's the draft's already happened, and so there's this kind of theme where we see Steve Rogers, a small, scrawny little dude, that has asthma, high blood pressure, like all of the ailments that prevent him from joining and enlisting, and so time after time, like he begins to forge these documents to try and get himself enlisted in the military, and
because he wants to serve his country.
Yeah.
He's got that burning drive and passion, right?
Yeah. And so why he's trying to get enlisted, we kind of see just his character in the background of like he hates bullies.
Yeah.
And so he's constantly standing up, and of course, being a scrawny little dude, he's constantly losing these fights. But finally he comes and he meets this doctor.
Right.
And this doctor kind of sees the potential in Rogers, where it's like, this is a good dude. And so he gets enlisted, and so this doctor kind of gives him this serum. And when he's doing this, he kind of says, okay, so this serum will make good things great,
right?
But bad things become worse. And so it kind of is like this. It magnifies and blows up. Yeah, the stuff.
What's already there.
Yeah,
there's a quote they say shortly after that, and he said something along the lines of, don't become a good soldier, be a good man.
Oh, yeah.
And it's that idea of what you're just saying. It's going to amplify him. And so he needs to make sure that his morality, what he saw in him, is staying pure.
Was this all in the movie?
It is.
Yeah.
See, I don't remember any of this. So good job. Good job. I read the book, but
Kris is like, I thought he was shooting webs by now.
Okay. Too far, John.
That's good.
No, it's good. That's good. That's interesting. Yeah, this is good stuff because I mean, So you're saying the serum magnifies what's already there, which plays into kind of his role in the Avengers,
right?
Because from what I can tell, what I can gather, and you guys can again take this down the road a little farther, he really is the moral example.
Yep.
I mean, and you brought this up just about his story arc. Why don't you just say that about the Steve Rogers story arc that Frank kind of taps into?
Well, so it's so interesting that all the other Avengers kind of have this moral crisis that really makes them kind of face their flaws, and they become a better person because of it. And Captain America is one of those where it's static. Like he's a good person at the beginning of the movie, and all the way through the next 22 films, his character line stays the same. Like, you can basically, that Steve Rogers is gonna stand up to bullies. He's gonna be one that is kind of like standing up to evil, and he's not gonna back down from a fight, regardless of if he wins or loses.
I mean, I think of the end game. When like
spoiler alert,
when everybody is wrecked by Thanos, and he's the only person that stands up, and he grabs Thor's hammer, and he's the only person, and he's willing to take on an army of people purely out of his morality. Yeah, it's just like, it was a powerful scene. Yeah,
1 versus 1,000. Yeah, absolutely.
But he's barely standing, like he was almost dead. Blood trickling down his chin, and And one thing I'd love to point out about this is what's super interesting about, and I just thought of this. Remember when we were going over Matthew, the Beatitudes? Yeah. The first place that he says you need to start out is humility. And I feel like that's where Steve Rogers started out more so than any other hero, is that place of meekness and humility. And I think that's what growed his character more than even so the serum or whatever it is that place where he had to start out being at the bottom. Yeah.
Oh, man. So this makes me, it kind of reminds me of a point. And I know the Turks kind of mentioned this in the book, but there's this point of where the colonel who's kind of driving this super soldier program, right? They're all at a boot camp, and of course Steve Rogers is like totally struggling, like he's behind the pack on this big mile run, right? He's like struggling to do push-ups, and so this colonel's like trying to get him to force, like, why in the world aren't you picking like this soldier? Like, he's a big dude, he's mean, he's like, it's like he's a perfect example of a good soldier. And the scientist says, well, nah, it's like I've already made up my mind. Like, I mean, Steve is a clear choice. Right. And the girl's like, it's like, he's making me cry. Look at him, like he's struggling to do push-ups. Like, no
something
way.
Like if I give him a shot, it's going to go through his arm or something like that.
Exactly.
Like he's just so weak.
And so to prove his point, the colonel grabs a grenade, pulls the pin, and throws it at the soldiers. Right. And we see like all these men scatter, but Steve Rogers, he jumps on the grenade. Right. Yeah. And like covers the blast. And like in that moment, we kind of see, oh man, this is a good dude.
Absolutely.
Which is really interesting because this is before he has the serum, correct?
Right, absolutely.
Right? And so, like you said, it's this idea that he's there all along. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to point out some of these parallels. Obviously, Steve Rogers, the fact that he's this moral compass, I think we have to draw some immediate connections to he is a Jesus-like character. We're not saying Captain America is Jesus, right? But it's something to think about that, I think about like, think about Philippians 2:5-7, that talks about, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being the very form of God, did not seek equality God was something to be, grasped or clung to or whatever, but instead he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Yeah. And I think, even that parallel there, thinking about Steve Rogers, that although it's kind of like he was already in the weakling form before he became powerful. Sure. But there's a Christ-like similarity to where Steve Rogers, in his weakness, like lays his life down. And it's like there's a parallel there between Jesus, being God, actually in a weird way becomes weak. Right. He becomes weak to lay down his life. And so, it's an interesting parallel. Yeah. Something I'm just thinking of,
Well, man, and even Christ, like blowing kind of the conception of what the Jews would have thought a Messiah was going to look like. Here Jesus shows up as a baby. Like, I mean, with no super strength. He's not like anything crazy. He's
born in backwoods Israel. Yeah. Bethlenem's not a big town. It's not a booming metropolis, right?
Yeah. And so, so we see, this normal, Jesus, as much as normal as we can use as Jesus is, but it's this idea of like, there's, again, no superhero abilities. He's not blasting with, his enemies with laser vision and things like that. And you draw the parallel with Steve Rogers is like, he's kind of one of those superheroes that doesn't have a whole
power.
Bunch of,
right. He really doesn't, right?
It's super strength.
Eventually, right? But it's really his goodness that drives him.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah, that's his greatest strength.
And Frank touches on it in the book, but his leadership ability to bring out the best of the heroes around him. So like Jesus brought out the best of the qualities of the apostles, right? And it's the same aspect for Steve Rogers, is he was the leader because he brought out the best in everyone. And he was that place where you talked about last night to youth. We did a throwback last night. Woo. Whoop, whoop. And he was talking about that place of candor. And is somebody able to speak in your life? Does somebody have that authority to call you to a better place? I think Steve Rogers is that place for all the heroes of that. I mean, yes, the moral compass, but also that place of like leadership where he says, hey, we can be better and doing better. And Thor, you need to stop being, so narcissistic and start working as a team. You know what I mean? There's just areas that he's calling the group to be in a better place.
Yeah.
Sure.
No, so good. And maybe you guys, I know one thing that he also wrote on in the book, and again, I'm going to default to your wisdom here on the storyline, but Bucky, his arc is a way that like, he's kind of a bad guy. I mean, from what I remember, right? I mean, he's kind of programmed, if you will. I don't know, is that the right word or whatever? Exactly. But it's, it's really interesting because there's almost like a savior, I don't want to say savior complex, but this idea that Captain will not give up on Bucky, and becomes one who actually, even though it becomes a source of contention between him and Iron Man, correct?
Yeah.
And so I don't know, go ahead and describe that for me.
Go ahead, yeah.
So Bucky had actually killed Iron Man's parents.
That's right.
And so Iron Man took it obviously personal and seek vengeance. And Captain America was standing against it. And Iron Man got pretty much the government behind him of like they need to chase this Bucky guy down.
Right.
And Captain America wasn't standing for it. And because he was brainwashed, didn't know what he's doing, whatever the reason is, I can't quite remember. But is that idea that Captain America didn't find it moral for Iron Man to seek vengeance, so he wouldn't let it happen.
Yeah.
Is what I...
Yeah. I was going to say, and Iron Man was like ready to kill him.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's like this, it's almost like Iron Man's kind of taking this stepping across the line of like, no, he's just going to take a life out of pure vengeance.
Right.
And yeah, like you said, Captain America steps up as, again, to be that moral compass of like, I'm not going to let you hurt my friend.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, totally. I mean, like,
yeah, so you got like these ideas of like justice, right?
Yeah.
I mean, would it be just for Iron Man to do that? In a way, God looking at us in our sinful condition, looking at our rebellion against him, we were enemies of God. The Bible says, God has every right, but yet Jesus steps in. And I don't mean that in a sense of like, it's not like Jesus is Captain America and the Father's Iron Man. Don't do that. Don't do that, right? They were united in purpose, right? But there's a parallel here because there's something about us that we, as human beings, we long for redemption. And so Bucky's story is this story of redemption.
Right.
And it takes an advocate.
Right.
It takes someone acting on his behalf. He can't save himself.
Right.
He needs an outside influence. And when really they could have been justified in wiping him off the map.
Right.
It's it's Captain America. And so again, there's this Christ-like quality there.
Right. And even to add to it, when Captain America is trying to save Bucky, Bucky is still trying to kill him at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah.
Like he still is like in this enraged place where he wants, and Captain America is still advocating, like you said, for him.
Yeah.
And I mean, Bucky, even outside Iron Man, he was he was the hitman for Hydra. Like he was the right-hand man of menace to society. You know what I mean? And so it's an incredible picture of like, totally, like you said before, undeserved. There's no way he deserved for what Captain America did for him. Yeah, he chose to do it.
And so again, if you're listening to this, even if you're not familiar with the story, isn't it amazing that these movies have blown box office records?
Right.
I mean, people flock to these movies, and what an amazing point of conversation. So if you know someone, if you're someone who's listening to this, someone who's really into these stories, even if you're not, to just point out these things of like, wow, I was listening to this podcast and they were kind of pointing out like how similar this is to Jesus. Do you suppose, do we long for those things because we want those things to be true? I mean, it could be a really good point of conversation as I was, just thinking on that kind of stuff.
For sure.
Any other thoughts or what I don't know if you guhad any quotes or any things underlined that you want to go to?
Yeah, there's a quote in there, and it kind of referred to this Bucky thing. He had quoted it in here. I don't know where it is, but he had talked about, he said, Jesus did the ultimate sacrifice of dying for his enemies, which is a sacrifice Captain America wouldn't even do. And it's that aspect of, it does put a lot in perspective. You know, we view him like, as a watcher, you view Captain America, it's like, wow, look at the morality. Look how pure and good this person is. And yet Jesus is even several steps above him. And it just tells you the built up, I'm going to say, pension with the world and the spirit. You know, there's so many people that Christianity just offends them because it contrary to their ideas. And it's like, how do you look at this story and be moved and not look at Christ and be moved even more so? Right. You know what I mean? And it's the idea that he talks about. And actually, you have any more that you wanted to quote?
No, I was going to say, well, just those sacrificing things of the qualities of it's like even the men that, you know, the soldiers that go to war, and, you know, they do these heroic acts. It's interesting that sometimes it's like, they'll admit, well, it's like, we have this idea of like, we throw like, you know, soldiers standing up for America and things like that. And obviously that is a huge sacrifice to serve. But in the moment, it's like this, well, I'm serving, like I did that. I jumped out in front of a bullet to save my buddies. And so it's like this idea of like, you know, we can sacrifice for our friends, our family. And so you were getting to like, there's kind of these sacrificial things that we do. And like Jesus takes it just one step farther, which is so powerful. Yeah. Right. It's like, now Jesus was willing to die for his enemies. Yeah. And what you said, like, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's right. Yeah. Like, oh my goodness. Like Steve Rogers, there's some good, Messiah kind of qualities to him. Yeah. But Jesus is obviously the better Messiah. He's the he's the real.
So would you say that you know, Captain actually kind of stopped short of that, where, you know, he was willing to jump on the grenade for his friends. Right. He was maybe even willing to fight for Bucky, but was he really willing to sacrifice his life for Bucky? Yeah. That's an interesting question. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't nowhere in the story arc do we see that. Right. But yeah, you're right. Christ would be greater in that capacity because, you know, he actually is willing to lay down his life. You know, one of the things that Frank highlights in this book is actually a true story by a Navy SEAL by the name of Michael Masur. Hopefully I'm saying that last name right. But he talks about how, you know, these men were kind of like doing these raids and kind of going through the streets of, was it Baghdad, or I believe it's in Iraq, you know, but anyway, at one point, so he's going through and they can hear, you know, that there's a call to kill the Americans, and, you know, that's going out over the public address speakers, you know, coming from a mosque. And so they're sweeping these areas, and all of a sudden, a grenade comes in, hits Michael in the chest, drops down to the ground. And Michael knows he doesn't have enough time to grab it and throw it back from where it came. Yeah. And there's a doorway behind him. He can either bail and save his own life, but that means his two buddies that were in there would die. Yeah. And so instead, Michael jumps on top of the grenade and basically muffles the blast and dies 30 minutes later. And there was someone right there who was willing to, and I mean, his friends, you know, spoke at his funeral, and he was given the, you know, I think the Medal of Honor and you know, by President George W. Bush. And I mean, just an incredible story. And so it's so interesting to see, again, sometimes we have these myths, we have these stories, right? That we look at, we go, isn't that great? And then there's whispers of truth. I mean, the Michael Masur is a true story. I mean, here's a Navy SEAL who laid down his life, I mean, willingly, made a choice to sacrifice himself so that, you know, his two buddies there would live, you know, which is just crazy to think about. But yet there's a greater story. Yeah, that's true. Right. Beyond all this, that goes beyond just dying for friends. You know, but like you said, Jesus laid down his life for his enemies.
And I was just reading it this morning, and what's amazing about it is even when he did, I was reading about Stephen in Acts, and he was stoned to death. And what Stephen said was so amazing. He saw this vision of heaven, and he said, Lord, receive my spirit, forgive them for their sins. And it reminded me of that moment when Jesus was on the cross. He was still in that place of like, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Yeah. So that's even another step further than just laying his life down. He was even praying on their behalf.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways.
Wow. So I was just thinking about, Jesus being the greater captain, right? Jesus stood up to bullies. Jesus, he stood up for the impoverished, the ones who did not have justice. Jesus fought for justice, much like Captain America. And just the scene that you guys, was that in Infinity War? You said where, he's the last one standing, in a way, that's like, it's like, that's the cross. That's the picture of the cross. Jesus, he's the only righteous one. He's the only one. And it's his last stand. And he's, the enemies, the powers of darkness, the principalities, powers, certainly all gathered there thinking that they had won, much like, Thanos. In-game or Thanos, Right, okay. See, I know that. I know some stuff, right? Yeah. But then to think about that, the Jesus at the cross, man, he fell on that grenade. He fell on that cross. He took that punishment for us.
Well,
and so again, it's interesting to think about those things and draw those parallels with, Captain America. So I'm excited about this series. I think we're going to have a good time. So
for sure. Yeah. And again, it's like, it's cool. Like, it's culture. It's easy to talk about.
Yeah.
And so, I like what you said, like, it's easy to engage like neighbors and family that maybe that aren't Christians, that you can kind of engage with this story a little bit and pull in the gospel into it.
Yeah. And once again, I love this book. I love Frank's ministry. And so if you're watching this and you're like, you got a grandson or a granddaughter or, a loved one who is really into these storybooks, but maybe not so much Jesus. This is something that maybe might open their eyes to some of these possibilities and get them to consider Christ, because these are stories that our hearts long for.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think next week we go on to talk about Iron Man and, not so Steve Rogers. It's kind of the opposite, right? Yeah. So what do we redeem from him? Well, you're going to have to tune in next week. You guys have any other thoughts as we bring this to a close?
No, sir.
No, sir.
All right. Well, once again, thanks for joining us, and subscribe, share. Give this podcast to somebody who might enjoy, these Hollywood stories. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.